Well, good morning, everyone. Go ahead and turn in your your Bible to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, though there are a couple of songs that are based on texts in Ecclesiastes that we have. We're going to be looking at this book over the series of the next few weeks. Just a reminder that this is a lecture-style class, though, of course, I do would love to hear your feedback and answer any questions that you may have. We'd have to have a conversation about that outside of the Bible study time, the allotted Bible study time. Now, some of you may recall that we've studied Ecclesiastes before and that I've taught Ecclesiastes before. So the logical question might be, well, why are we studying Ecclesiastes again? When we looked at it the last time, it was about seven years ago. We have a fair number of new members since then. Thomas, Brian, Sheila, Teresa, Chris, Braden is meeting with us. We have as well those that are online. So it's worth looking at it for their sake because they weren't studying it with us the last time we looked at it. Ecclesiastes is a book about life, all facets of it. And it is the type of book that you can come back to. Proverbs are very similar in this regard as well. That as one gains life experience, whether one is a Christian or not, and one gains spiritual experience, that you can come back and you can reread Ecclesiastes and have a greater appreciation for it. There's certain writings that are like that. I've been told that there was a English teacher in my high school that said that it was useless to have King Lear in the high school curriculum because kids couldn't have an appreciation, couldn't understand anything that King Lear is going through. Which, if you recall, he was an older man. His health starts to fail, and he even starts to lose grip on sanity by the end of the play. And he also deals with 3 children, his 3 daughters, Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia, one of which is genuine in her affection towards him, and the other 2 are insincere and are really just manipulating and trying to grab the inheritance. Certainly, teenagers would have a difficult time, I think, having never experienced ungrateful children and inheritance issues and losing a grip on sanity as a result of old age. That doesn't mean they're completely incapable of understanding and recognizing, but it is certainly something that if a person comes back in their 50s and 60s or 70s or 80s and reads King Lear, they might see things better from his perspective or understand things better than they would if they had read it when they were 15. Well, Ecclesiastes is very much like that. There's certain things in this book that one can appreciate more. And then finally, repetition is the mother of all learning. It's inevitable that we would, I think, come back to texts. And there's some texts that we have looked at in the last 10 years multiple times, and that's not a bad thing. We learn by repetition and by reinforcement. And sometimes when we look at something and study it once, we will walk away getting something out of it differently than what we would before. So, Lord willing, and if I keep myself on track, we will get through chapter 1, verse 1 through 11 today, and as well discuss the introduction to this text. Otherwise, we'll just put that into next week's lesson. The first thing we will ask before we start analyzing the text is the who, what, when, where, why sort of questions. And the who and the where are answered pretty much right there in verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then in verse 12 of chapter 1 as well, you'll see I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So that gives us the author as Solomon. David had many sons, of course, but there was only one who legitimately, there was a couple that tried. Absalom tried to usurp authority. Adonijah, at the end of David's life, tried to usurp authority. But there was only one son that was legitimately reigning after David, and that is Solomon from Jerusalem. This term here that's in verse 1 and verse 12 is interesting. It is translated the preacher in most texts. You may have, if you're using the NIV, it may be teacher. That's also a good translation there. The word, Hebrew word, and William, you actually found the Hebrew. Thank you. Koleth, or maybe it's Koheleth. I'm not good with the Hebrew pronunciation. Literally means gatherer. So a couple of things to note about this. Solomon is writing in his capacity, in a spiritual capacity, and from one who has observed life. This is not him writing as though his experience as king gets pulled into it. He is not writing in, this is an authoritative sense in my kingly sovereignty, but he is writing as one who is observed, much like he did in Proverbs. This idea of gathering comes up at the end of the book. If you want to turn to the last chapter, 12. And before we, most times we jump to verse 13 and 14, but look at what he says before that. He says, moreover, because the preacher or the gatherer was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought, or the gatherer sought to find acceptable words and what was written, what was upright, words of truth. So we see here, he's gone out, he's sought, he's seeked, he's tested. We'll see that time and time again in this text. So it's rare that you would ever find the words of the gatherer, the son of David, king in Jerusalem there. But that is the process. That is literally what he did in order to write this book, in order to have the source material, if you were. Though of course he was also inspired by the Holy Spirit. That goes without saying. When did Solomon write this book? Well, we know from history that he reigned for 40 years, as did David, as did Saul, and that puts it in the kingdom split in 930 BC. So he had to have written the book somewhere in the range of 970 to 930. Having said that, it's unlikely that he wrote it at the beginning of his reign. Why do we say that? Why would it be closer to 930 than 970? Well, we're not going to read the entire text. But if you look at verse 13 of chapter 1, and you go to chapter 2, to verse 11, you'll see that he talks about a lot of things that he did, that he accumulated and tested wisdom, that he accumulated wealth, and he built great things and had many manservants and many slaves. You'll see that he tested and went ahead and looked at madness and looked at drink and looked at folly. All of these things that he did would take time both to accumulate and to test. These are things that he experienced. He also writes as somebody who has personal experience with the things that he's describing. If you turn to chapter 5, and you look at verse 8 to 10, he says here, if you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Now that is the experience of somebody who has been an administrator for a while, that understands that there is accountability in that structure. The bad things can happen, but he understands bureaucracy. Verse 9, moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. This is, again, the result of somebody who is experienced, that understands, I've got all this food on the table. It doesn't magically appear, this food on the table. This food came from the taxes and flowed through. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. This is from an observation of wealthy people, and I suspect, because of Solomon's great wealth, an observation over a lifetime of even himself. He had the gold bug just as much as the people that he is describing, though he recognizes its folly at the same time. His description in chapters 11 and 12. At the end of chapter 11, he says, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity." These are the words of a person who has experienced youth, and then we're not going to read the entire description. Chapter 12, verse 1 through 5. Verse 1 says, "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them." And then he goes ahead and he gives a very poetic description of a building that started to fall apart, a mill that started to fall apart. And the comparison is to how the body starts to break down and we get health problems in our older age. This is written, and it feels like when you're reading it, like somebody who is experiencing those health problems, not somebody who says, "Oh, I hear this starts to happen and that starts to happen." These are written as if somebody has experienced them. Solomon, for all his vaunted wisdom, which God granted him, and which we see in Ecclesiastes, is also one of the most foolish men that we will see. He's given to great foolishness at times in disobeying the Lord when it comes to the accumulation of chariots and foreign wives and the alliance that he sought with Egypt. All of these things are directly opposed to God's will in the law of Moses, and he went for all of them, and it was a weakness and a downfall. If it was written at the end of his life, go ahead and turn to 1 Kings chapter 11. The first three verses say, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. I'm not sure why Solomon chose to disobey this. It may be that he thought that his great wisdom would make him immune and that he would see through that, unlike other people. In other words, the classic, "Oh, those were weaker men over there, but I'm strong, I know better." If ever there's been a warning of let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall, here's a good example right here. Because he surrounded himself not just with one of those women that the Lord said, pretty much he had one of those women from every one of the nations. And do not be wise in your own estimation. It's actually Solomon that wrote that. If that's the case, he may have had his own folly in mind, because he fell and he fell hard. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wife turned away his heart, it said. Yes, this is clearly an ego-driven man as well. It's tragic, it's sad. Look at when this happened, though. Verse 4, it says, "For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David." So if he wrote this in his older age, he either had to have written it before this happened, or he had repented and wrote it afterwards. And at the end of his life, he's come to his senses. I'd like to think that is the case. The rest of the text in Kings tells us that God sent means to discipline him. that his reign was plagued. In verse 14, now the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. Verse 25, he was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, besides the trouble that Hadad caused, referring to Rezon. And then there is the rebellion of Jeroboam. And this is exactly what God had foretold to David, that if his son Solomon goes ahead and departs, he will be disciplined. But by the time we get to Solomon's death, in verse 41 and 40 to 43 of chapter 11, 1 Kings chapter 11, we don't see the text specifically saying he repented. I know that we would all like to think that he did. We don't know 100% for sure. So the book was likely written at the end. Now, why go through all of this? Why go through all of this other than to point out that Solomon is eminently qualified to write this book, and we're going to see that in the latter part of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 2, throughout chapter 2, that as far as an individual who has experienced life and is making observations on it, that he definitely is one who is qualified, as he says in chapter 2, verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I. So, what was Solomon's purpose for writing this book? And that will help us answer our question about what's our purpose for studying this book. Verse 13, go ahead and zero in and go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Let's go to verse 13. I set my heart to seek and search out wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. He is, as we pointed out already, looking at life. He's looking at it from a physical perspective, and he looks at it from a spiritual perspective, and he puts the physical in the context of the spiritual, so that we can hear at the end what his conclusion is. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every single secret thing, whether good or evil. He does this by a pattern of observation and testing, which we'll see over and over again. 4 verse 1, then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. Verse 4, again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. Verse 7, then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. Chapter 6 and verse 1, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun and is common among men. 8 verse 9, all of this I have seen and applied to my heart, the work that is done under sun. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt, etc., etc. It is a book that's built on observation, and it is a book of seeming contradiction. Now, I know that seems like an odd thing to say, and I don't mean in the sense of a contradiction in paradox is a better word. Two things that seem to be at odds with each other, but both of them can be true at the same time. Not a contradiction in the sense that the atheist or the skeptic would go and latch onto. But what do I mean by this? Go ahead and look at verse 3 of chapter 1. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And this is in the context of vanity. This is how Solomon introduces it. It's vanity. And we see a very bleak picture he points in the next few verses. But now go ahead and turn to chapter 2 and verse 24. And this same Solomon says, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. So he's saying, go ahead and enjoy labor. Go ahead and enjoy your fruit of the labor, and it's a gift. Oh, but there's really no profit in it, and it's vain. Is he contradicting himself? We're going to see and explore that further, that oftentimes the context and the perspective that one has on it, looking at things from a purely physical perspective, we'll see vanity over and over and over and over and over again. Putting things in their proper spiritual perspective, though, helps us to gain an appreciation and an enjoyment of life without getting carried away with the things of life. And so Solomon, in his reflection, is reconciling the two as we go throughout the book. Can we? And what is the ultimate meaning of life? And we all know the last verse. We all know that that's his conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, for that is man's all. But it's beneficial for us to go through how he comes to that conclusion, why he decides to, after looking at all of these things, that's the conclusion he comes to. How does he get to that conclusion? We want to study that. Our purpose. Why should a Christian study Ecclesiastes? I know that there's some that are dismissive of studying Old Testament in general. We've looked at that before, and we see that there's often great benefit and many lessons to be learned from the Old Testament. But I'll just simply say, Solomon points it out in verse 9, there's nothing new under the sun. We're going to see that the circumstances that Solomon is describing are the same things that we go through in life today. Our technology may have changed, but life hasn't changed. There's a lot of things that we do, and it's everyday reality that we can look at. We also struggle with balancing the physical with the spiritual. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, there it is. Paul says, since you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where God is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth. Now, we understand when we recognize that, and we've studied these verses before, that this is a matter of priority setting in life. Because certainly we can't not go to work. We can't not pay our bills. We can't not feed and clothe ourselves. We can't not make our car payments and make sure our oil gets changed in our cars. We're physical beings living in a physical world, and most of our life is spent in physical things. But we have to make sure that those physical things are put in their proper context and understood in a spiritual context. And many of the things that Solomon writes today is just as relevant for our struggles as they were then when he wrote them about 1,000 years before Christ was born. And a word of warning, Solomon, just like in the Proverbs, gives general truths. They're not axioms necessarily. They're not 100% of the true 100% of the time. You can always find exceptions to what he's talking about. And that's fine. Just like the Proverbs, they are general truths. All right. So now that we've gone ahead and looked at our purpose for studying this book, let's go ahead and get into the text itself. We won't get very far, first 11 verses today, if the Lord wills. We already looked at verse 1. Verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That has to be one of the most attention-grabbing introductions to any book in the Bible. You have to hand it to the Holy Spirit. There are other books that have very eye-catching introductions. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I will utterly consume everything from the land, Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 2. Anybody reading that would be like, wait, what? The Holy Spirit is very good at just grabbing a person's attention, but this one is doubly shocking. Vanity of vanities, everything is vanity. And especially it's shocking, I'll tell you, the first time I read it, I believe, in the Revised Standard Version, and I was 17, and their translation of this is meaningless, everything is meaningless, which I don't think is quite what Solomon is going for. But I'm going along going, that's an odd thing to have in the Bible. Isn't the Bible all supposed to be about the meaning of life and finding deeper meaning? And now this man says everything is meaningless or useless is another way that you'll find it. And then to prove his point, he tells you how useless it is for the next few verses. I think, wow, this is shocking that the Bible would have something like this in it. At least on the surface, it's shocking, and it certainly does grab our attention. I'd like us to take the time to consider what this word is. It's very important that we take a look at this word because Solomon uses it many, 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 many times in the text. Even when I was quoting from a couple of verses in the middle of the text, you'll have noticed that that word appeared again. So let's take the time to understand what it is he's talking about. Vanity. You'll have, most of you probably have that. It's in the King James, New American Standard, among others. I just picked the ones that are most commonly used. It can also be rendered meaningless, which the new NIV has, pointless for the ISV, and you might also see absurd, futile, nonsense, etc. The Hebrew word is, and thank you again, William, is habel. And I'd like us to look at a couple of other areas where it's used, and that will help us get an indication of how it's used by other readers or other authors. So go ahead and turn to Job chapter 21. Now, this is Job in one of his defenses to his friends. And in 21 verse 34, he says, "How then can you comfort me with empty words, habal, since falsehood remains in your answers?" So this is ineffective or useless or at odds with its seeming intended purpose. So his friends had come there supposedly to comfort him. But we know from reading Job and studying it before that they're pretty much doing the exact opposite. So they're words that are designed to comfort. They're not delivering on that promise. They are at odds with their intended seeming purpose or are useless in affecting the thing that they said that they were going to accomplish. Psalm 94, verse 11. The Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are futile. Another one of the prophets said, "My thoughts are greater than your thoughts. My thoughts are above your thoughts." The thoughts of man compared to the thoughts of the Lord are of such little value, comparatively speaking. Even our wisest sayings from our smartest men and women of the world throughout history, compared to the thoughts of the Lord, have very little value. They are futile in that regard. Isaiah chapter 57, verse 13. "When you cry out, let your collection of idols deliver you, but the wind will carry them all, a breath will take them." Habal. They're ineffective and insubstantial, these idols. They have no true substance. They have a physical presence. You can point to them, you can see them, but as far as their effectiveness to do anything, they're useless. A wind, a breath will take them away. And finally, Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 17. I think this one is my favorite of them all because it really does, I think, capture this. It says, "Still our eyes failed us, watching vainly for our help." Vainly, there's our habal. "In our watching, we watched for a nation that could not save us." So this is at the end. They are still hoping that you remember that the various prophets said, your only hope at this point is repentance and putting your trust in the Lord. You go ahead and you put your hope in Egypt, nothing's going to happen. You have all these alliances you've made with the countries around you, and you think on paper you look safe. You're not. Those people are all going to abandon you at the end. And here is, our eyes failed us. Here are the people at the wall waiting for their allies to show up. And they're looking for that hope to appear on the horizon to the point where they can't even keep their eyes open anymore. We watch, and the nation never comes that could save us. It was, you've heard the expression, Oh, I'm waiting for a phone call from so-and-so or something, and someone might say, well, don't hold your breath. And we know what that means. It means you're wasting your time. It's not going to happen. It's empty and it has no value. These nations were never showing up, and they never did. It was vain. So all of that helps us to get into what Solomon is saying when he says, vanity of vanity, everything is vanity. Okay, well, Solomon, prove it. Because some of us could say, well, I find lots of meaning in my life, which is good. I could probably give that. Solomon, prove it, that life is vain. And that is exactly what he does from verse 3 to 11, which we're now going to read straight through and then evaluate and look at. It said, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rose. The wind goes towards the south and turns to the north. The wind whirls about continually and again comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor. Men cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. Now, this is bleak, it's depressing, and Solomon's not the only one to have ever asked the question, well, what's the point of life if we all just die at the end? But Solomon is talking about more than just my individual life or your life. He's applying that vanity to life in general, the activities of life, and even the physical world. He's broadened the scope out. When he says vanity of vanities, all or everything is vanity, he means it. He's including history itself as vanity. He really does mean all. How he goes ahead and he proves that is he looks at a variety of cycles in the physical world and in life and in history. Generally speaking, life is a cycle, I guess you could say. It often seems to a certain extent in a treadmill. Now, we can point to times in our life that are quite chaotic, but generally speaking, one day echoes the previous day and will likely be the next day. The person gets up and they get ready to go to work or school or whatever it is, and they do that activity. They come home, they do chores or they do homework, they relax, they go to bed, they wake up, and they repeat the cycle day after day. Solomon states that same for the physical world and for society, but adds an element of futility. Let's look at what he says in the work world. He says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another comes. So that's the classic, well, what's the point of it? Because I work and I work and I work, and then we all just pass away and we all just die. One would think from one generation to a next that might have a cumulative benefit for everybody. But besides the fact that an inheritance can be passed to a fool, Solomon goes ahead and in verse 11 says there's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be remembrance of things that are to come by those that are after. Our short life cycle makes it so that we are essentially very forgetful from an intergenerational perspective. Now we might say, oh, we know lots of dates in history. We know of events that have happened, and maybe we know their significance, but we don't necessarily truly understand it. For the majority of people, there is no remembrance of the things that have come. The lessons of the past oftentimes have to be retaught again. That definitely is vanity. That is the definition of vanity right there. Now note this, of course, with the idea of there's nothing new under the sun. I'll say that this is a generalization. It's not meant to be specific. I had somebody when I was talking to them about this one time, and they talked to me afterwards, and they said, "Oh, brother, there's a new song that the Beatles came out with in Hey Jude, and they wrote it in the '60s, and that song didn't exist in Solomon's day. That's something new." Solomon's not necessarily talking about something specific. New songs are being written all the time. But song itself in general, entertainment itself in general, that's the same in Solomon's day as it is today. It might be different art forms, but people have always made art. People have always made and listened to music, and people always will do that. Certainly there was not the car or the telephone in the day, and today we have it. But there was the need for transportation in Solomon's day, whether it be by foot. People needed to get their goods to the market. People need to get their goods to market today. The difference is that we do it with trucks or rail or boat, and we do it at a higher speed. It's the same fundamental activity, though. The telephone is new, but the need for people to communicate for work and to keep in touch with family and to spread the gospel, that's the same need. That's nothing new under the sun in that regard about what people are busying themselves with and what they're doing generally in life. And so that is nothing new under the sun, conveys that idea of vanity that Solomon is talking about. Verse 5 to 7, Solomon talks about and looks at cycles in the physical world. Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. It does that every single time. Wind goes to the north, goes to the south, repeats. There's a circuit. Rivers run into the sea. Sea isn't full. Water comes back, repeats the cycle. Now, Solomon's intent here is not to describe. I know that some have said, oh, this is hydrological or the water cycle that appears in chapter 7. Solomon's purpose was not to write a science text. It just so happens that this is incidental and happens to be one of the first descriptions of a scientific truth that we see captured in the scriptures, and one of the first in literature that we see of the water cycle being described, and it's in the Bible. And it does show that the Bible and science do not have to be at odds with each other. But Solomon's purpose in writing that is not to say, hey, look at the hydrological cycle. He's looking and saying, there is a lot of energy being expended and a lot of activity to go on just to do the exact same thing over again. Nothing permanent is actually happening here. It is just repeating the same thing. No wonder man can. All things are full of labor, but man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear with hearing. This is the definition. That constant repetitiveness, this constant labor without ever really producing anything long-lasting and of value and permanency, is vanity. It's in the physical world, it's in the work world, it's in history. And Solomon is not alone in his assessment. If you turn back to Job, who had every reason, of course, to be not in a good mood. Job chapter 14, verse 1 and 2, Job says, man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. David said something very similar. James as well talks about our life being a vapor. And Isaiah quotes, and James and other New Testament authors quote him as well, as saying, the flower withers, the grass fades. What is your life? It's like those flowers. It's like that grass. It disappears. It goes away. The word of the Lord abides forever. So, you'll see the, for the next slide, if we want to go there. Solomon certainly does really start off the book with getting us kind of depressed, doesn't he? So why are we studying this book? What's the value of studying this book where somebody starts off by saying everything's vanity or useless or seemingly meaningless? Well, I want you to note that at this point in time in the book, Solomon has only been looking at things from a purely physical perspective. You'll notice he has not even mentioned God yet. In fact, he doesn't even do that until verse 13. And this is the bleak physical perspective of life if all we have is a physical perspective. So what lesson can we get from that before we start getting into the deeper things and the specific observations that Solomon makes, which we'll start with next week, in what he tested and didn't test? I want you to go ahead and think in general. Sometimes in order for us to appreciate our salvation, our spiritual blessings, the hope of heaven we have, it's beneficial for us to picture our life without it. I don't know if you've ever done this. I don't know if you've ever gone ahead and thought about, what if I had never become a Christian? What would my life be like? And of course, there's days where I think, oh, well, X, Y, and Z, which I've always wanted to do, I could go ahead and do them. And that's foolish thinking, because when I'm being honest, I realize, I think actually my life would be pretty lonely and bleak and depressing if I had never become a Christian. And right now, I often think of things that go on in life, and I do remind myself continually, ultimately, we've got heaven as our hope. So the things that are going on in our life right now that might seem like they are very, very difficult, and without downplaying that they can be very, very difficult, in the context of heaven, when we put things in a spiritual perspective, that really does help us to appreciate the salvation and the spiritual blessings that we have. So keeping in mind that right now, the vanity that Solomon is talking about is when we look at life solely from a physical perspective. Now that concludes our introductory lesson for Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We'll go ahead and take about a 10-minute break at